Thanks very much, Jane. The one question I want to ask, though, I'll tell you what, if you agree with it, you don't have to say anything. In terms of how much time shall I leave at the end for questions? We've got an hour, haven't we? It's 12 till 1. If I aim to say, I don't know, 35, 40 minutes, something like that, and then leave 20 minutes for questions, does that sound about right in terms of...
Uh, we usually do allow, yeah, sort of 15, 20 minutes. So
Right, okay.
just
Right, so if I'm not winding up by 22 or quarter to 1, you better sort of, make
okay.
noises in my direction. But I've got a watch here to try and keep track of it. Right, okay, thanks a lot. So, yeah, Neil Pettinger, I'm one of the co-leads of the AphA branch in Scotland. And as Jane mentioned, I'm a freelance healthcare data analyst. Um, Used to be a proper NHS data analyst. And my obsession, my interest, my overriding interest is in patient flow. And I mainly look at acute hospital patient flow, but I also make occasional forays into looking at patient flow as it affects primary care and ambulance services and social care as well. So, and it's the kind of thing, it literally keeps me awake at night. And the talk I want to give today, so I'll put I'll share my screen and I'll put my slides on. Where are we? There we go. So that's the heading of the talk. I hope this is the one that was advertised. It's called Heaviness Past, Heaviness Present, and Heaviness Future. And then it's got a very kind of it's got a subtitle which there's a danger here that I'm kind of overselling this because measuring and describing, yes, finding solutions to exit block. Well, I think the data is part of that finding of the solutions, but it's not. There's no magic bullet here. What I've come up with, I think, is a way of describing exit block in a way that's a little bit more sophisticated than it used to be, because I think it needs to be. So the talk I've got it as I've structured it is in 7 bits. So that's probably going to be about 5 minutes for each bit if I get this right, isn't it? There we go. Terms and conditions, the unscheduled care pathway diagram, the flowology grid, the gold run. The gold run, that'll be interesting to see if anyone on the call is older than about 45 and has any memory of a TV show called Blockbusters. The fullness hypothesis is dead. Long live the heaviness hypothesis. That's when we finally get to this sort of AMU heaviness thing. And then I'm going to leave time at the end for questions, comments, and criticisms. This is a kind of work in progress that I've got here that I'm sharing, and I am always on the lookout for ideas for how to refine and develop this. So, terms and conditions. Um, Again, I've mentioned already that I'm obsessed with patient flow, and I use the Dobzhansky templates. So I don't know if any of you have come across this author. You can see that there's a red asterisk and it's footnoted there. Randy Olson wrote this book, which is one of my favorite books ever, called Houston, We Have a Narrative. It's a book about how to write about data, basically, aimed mainly at academic scientists. And one of the things that Randy Olson recommends in his book, he's got a whole chapter about it, is that you should have a Dobzhansky template for every talk that you do. And in fact, you can have a Dobzhansky template as like your mission statement for life. And this is what it looks like. Nothing in makes sense except in the light of And it's called the Dobzhansky template because there was a biologist called, I think his first name was Theodosius Dobzhansky. The reason why Randy Olson obsesses about biologists is that he himself was a marine biologist, professor of marine biology. Anyway, Dobzhansky's template looks like this. Well, it wasn't a template with Dobzhansky, it was just actually a quote, I think, from back in the 60s. He said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." So, in fact, you can apply the Dobzhansky template to very grand things, right? An entire academic discipline. I think in his book, Randy Olson also says, he gives another example, nothing in geology makes sense except in the light of plate tectonics. It's almost as if you can find some vital concept in your subject area that is so critical that nothing else is understandable without it. So for me, patient flow, nothing in patient flow makes sense except in the light of Little's law. That's my kind of that's my modus operandi. Little's law. I'm hoping that at least most of you, if not all of you, know what Little's law is. So here's a reminder. Here's the Wikipedia page for Little's law. So none of this talk will make sense unless you've got some sort of grasp of Little's law. in Wikipedia's inimitable way, it's all a bit kind of it's all a bit opaque in mathematical queuing theory. It's like you're almost, even after the sort of fourth or fifth word, you've started to kind of drift off, haven't you? The long-term average number of customers, L, in a stationary system is equal to the long-term average. So let's translate this. Those are the three variables, lambda, W, and L. Lambda is the long-term average effective arrival rate. So this is me drastically summarizing that Wikipedia page. W is the average time that a customer spends in the system. And L is the long-term average number of customers in a stationary system. So let's translate that into patients. The long-term average effective arrival time, if we're talking about inpatients in a hospital, that's the average number of admissions per day. W is the average length of stay, measured in days. And L is the average number of people occupying beds on any one day. So it's how many, how long, how full is how I characterize it. Here's an example. We're going to talk a little bit more about this example. It's general medicine, as in downstream general medicine. So not front door general medicine, not acute medicine, general medicine. This is general internal medicine as a sort of downstream specialty. It's a real example from about a year ago, and I've looked at the data. So these are averages based on a year's activity, 6.5 admissions a day, average length of stay 9.6 days, and the average number of beds occupied per day was 61.7. So that bit of arithmetic is supposed to work. There's another asterisk. I'm obviously very fond of my asterisks. If you get, some of you will already have got your calculators out. So it doesn't, it's 62.4. What's he talking about? Well, there's some decimal places in the red and blue numbers that you can't see. And also, because we're often not looking at systems that are completely stable, we have to make one or two tweaks to it, but it's all surmountable. That's Little's law. And I characterize it, I tend not to use lambda, W, and L when I'm talking to ordinary people. I tend to characterize it as how many, how long, how full. So some of you have met me before and have endured some of my kind of pontifications on this subject will already know that this is my idea of what every clinical director in every hospital should be looking at least every week, possibly, well, at least every month, hopefully every week, and monitoring it kind of SBC style. So you've got your how many measure on the left, the 6.5 is the mean line there, bumping around week by week. Occasionally, there we go, we drifted over the upper control limit once. Average length of stay, much more variable, but still mainly within the control limits, and then average beds occupied per day. But my goal really is to use this control chart typology as a sort of stepping stone, because really what people should be looking at is not what is actually happening, but comparing that with what ought to be happening. So if you remember if you have a look at that subtitle line where it says Anytown General Hospital, General Medicine, bed allocation equals 55 beds, and then have a look at that green graph on the right. So what we're monitoring there week by week is the average number of beds occupied per day in any given week. And you can see that on a full week, it's going more than 70. So at the beginning and the end of the calendar year, of the financial year, it was just tipping over 70. On a quiet week, it was almost as low as about 51. And on average, you can see the horizontal line is about 61. That refers back to the Little's law calculation in the last slide. So let's just think about this. See the wood for the trees. That's no good, is it? If you've got a bed allocation of 55, and on average you're using 61, that's plainly no good if your ambition is to improve patient flow and you always want beds to be available for the next patient to go into them. So what you can do is recalculate the green graph and say, well, what if we went for a perfect scenario and your upper control limit, which we'll now call an upper specification limit, is pitched at 55. So that's what I've done there. I've created my green zone. So the jagged lines haven't changed. I'm just changed the way in which we would need to tweak these numbers, to tweak the control limit zones, so that people can see where they're trying to get to. So again, this is Little's law. I think when we're using it for something useful and sensible. In this particular example, I've said, right, you're going to achieve that, guys, by reducing your length of stay from 9.5 to whatever that is, 7.5, something like 7.6, and leave your average discharges per day the same. So that for me is Little's law. That's where we're trying to get to. We're trying to get people to understand Little's law. And that's, if you don't understand Little's law, you don't really understand how your kind of flow is working. The other bit of terms and conditions is, where do I get these strange phrases from? AMU heaviness past, AMU heaviness present, AMU heaviness still to come. From Charles Dickens, obviously. These are three pictures, drawings, cartoons, whatever, from one of the first editions of A Christmas Carol, which I still haven't read. In fact, I don't think I've even seen a film of it the whole way through. Maybe this Christmas is the time to change that. Hard to make sense of those diagrams. Anyway, that's kind of where it goes from. And this is what I mean by heaviness past, heaviness present, and heaviness future. So let's have a look at this graph for a second. What we're doing here is we're looking at an acute medical unit. So now we are in acute medicine. This is front door general medicine. This is the admission ward that all of the emergency medical admissions go to after they've been in A&E. Some AMUs also take admissions direct from GPs. Not so many of them, I don't think, these days. I think most of them insist on having a route via the ED. And what we've done is we've taken a snapshot at midday on the 25th of March, 2024, so about 21 months ago. And we've captured 58 patients in that snapshot because that's how many patients were occupying beds on that particular day. From memory, I think this was an AMU that had 68 beds. So that's whatever that is, 58 divided by 68 multiplied by 100. That'll give you your occupancy. So that's not bad, actually. That's the day when there was at that moment, there were 10 empty beds. And what I'm doing here is I've organized those lines. Those lines represent the length of time that the patient has been in the AMU so far. Okay, so that's what I call heaviness past. So when you take a snapshot and you say, how long have you been in so far, all of the patients, that's the heaviness past. And the way we sort of calculate, so what you can do is you can imagine that all of those blue lines carry a weight to them. So it's not just the number of blue lines, but it's also the length of stay of the blue line. So 58 is the fullness, that's the number of blue lines. But if you multiply that by the average length of stay so far, which is 47.6 hours, then you get 2,761. So some people would call those whatever, bed hours, occupied bed hours so far. But I prefer to call it heaviness just because. And then future heaviness, so if you have to think about heaviness yet to come. So I think this is the same snapshot, 25th of March, 2024, 12 o'clock. And because we've got the benefit of hindsight, we can also say it's those patients that we saw a minute ago in blue. Of course, none of their stays are completed. So how long have they got left to go? So again, we've ordered them differently. We've ordered them by the patient who's got the longest to go is now at the top, and the patient with the shortest to go. That's obviously a different order to the one we had before. And we can measure the bed hours still to come as 1,804. So the heaviness yet to come was quite a bit less than it was quite a bit lighter, I suppose is the phrase, than the bed hours that were accumulated before. So if you're that 1,804, if you just go back a slide, compares with 2,761. So the heaviness past was heavier than the heaviness future. Okay, and then heaviness present is when you combine them both together. And I'm not quite sure why I did this, probably just to confuse you. But I decided to take a different snapshot to do this. I don't know why I did that. For goodness sake, that's crazy. It really would have made more sense if I'd used the same one. Anyway, you get the idea. This is a few days early on in the same month. And so if you combine both, then that's heaviness present. That's what we would consider to be length of stay. There we go. Understood that. We don't need to talk about that. We might come back to that in a minute. Okay. And then the other thing I just wanted to say in terms of setting things up is that this concept that I want to talk about today of AMU heaviness is something that well, there you can see the date there on X, June the 2nd was when I think he must have invented it. And this is, you get an idea of how I try and get people's views and advice on whether I'm barking up the wrong tree or not even barking up a tree at all. I sort of tag the luminaries of the acute medicine world. There they are, and to sort of say, look, here's what I'm thinking. Can anyone see any holes in it or whatever? So that's what a lot of this comes out of, and a lot of these people that are tagged in that and others have all contributed to the development of this critique. So unscheduled care pathway diagram, again, conscious that there might be people on the call who don't not au fait with acute hospitals and how they work from a patient flow point of view. So this is the very, very oversimplified pathway diagram. Unscheduled patients come into the ED on the left, where they usually, invariably experience delays before they go into the acute medical unit. Of course, they don't all go into the acute medical unit, only about, I don't know, well, my rule of thumb with EDs and how many of them end up being admitted is something like between, about 25 and 30% of them. Depends on the hospital, depends on how much of it is farmed out to minor injuries unit and so on. But I think at a typical type 1 A&E department, it's going to be 25, 30% get admitted. And of the admissions from ED, probably a little bit more than half, or about half, go into the acute medical unit. The remainder go into surgical assessment or trauma orthopedics, or some of them go straight to the wards. But the acute medical unit is usually the main pinch point if you speak to staff in the ED. And acute medical units, once the patients finally make their way into it, they're often delayed there as well. So again, they don't all go on into the specialty wards, only about, I don't know, 60, 65% or so do. Again, that percentage varies and it's changed over the last few years because of the sort of dysfunction that hospitals are dealing with. So quite a lot of patients are discharged directly home from the acute medical unit. But the ones that need to go on to the specialty wards, they experience. And of course, we know that patients in specialty wards are also delayed before they can go home. We've got delayed discharges. So the whole thing's characterized by delay. And this bit here, this ED to AMU handover is the crucial pinch point in terms of the one that most directly affects 4-hour performance or 12-hour performance, or so when people talk about exit block and they don't qualify it with any other terms, then they're usually talking about the exit block that's experienced by patients in the ED waiting to be admitted, and it's usually the AMU that's the biggest sticking point in that process. So the flowology grid is the next bit. How am I doing for time? It's about, oh, that's okay. I think I'm on track. So the flowology grid is a way of getting to coming to terms with the sort of cause and effect in the system. So, as I say, this is only looking at the acute hospital part of the system. So a really big whole system, health and care system grid would have rather more than 3 columns. You'd have ambulances and primary care over on the left. You'd have, post acute type hospital rehab type facilities to the right of the wards. You'd have social care, you'd have care homes and so on. So it could be quite a complicated diagram, but usually I'm just talking to hospital audiences who are trying to do something within the 4 walls of the hospital. So let's stick to this. And this grid is a throwback to something I used to do yonks ago. Did a lot of work with Professor Mohammed when he was working at Bradford University and with the Yorkshire Academic Health. What was it called? The Academic Health Science Network. Was that AHSN? And we did a load of Flowopoly workshops in various hospitals in Yorkshire back in, I don't know, 2016, 2017, something like that. And what we would do is we would replay a bad day in the life of the hospital. So I can't remember which Yorkshire hospital this was a bad day for, but it was in November 2017 or whenever it was, 70% was a bad day. And some of you will be smiling because most of you will be thinking most hospitals in the UK would kill to be 70.5% compliance. What do you mean bad day? That's a day that you dream of. Anyway, not in 2017, it wasn't. That was a bad day. And we would get people having replayed a bad day, with cards and tables and goodness knows what else. We would summarize it in this grid. And we would get them to think, what caused it to be a bad day? And we get, people's comments from the room. And what you found, typically in that sort of workshop session, is people said, well, it's the fullness of the downstream wards. So let me just go through these grids. So the columns are the staging posts, A&E assessment wards, like they were in the previous slide. And the 3 rows are the Little's Law variables: how many, how long, how full. So if you take the A&E squares as an example, 166 attendances on that day, the 25th of November, whatever year it was. 240 minutes was the average length of stay that those 166, so it's just a coincidence that it happens to be on that day, exactly 4 hours. And then the fullness is 25.7. So again, approximately, it doesn't always work out the arithmetic like perfectly for anything, but if you take 166 and you multiply it, well, not by 240, but by 240 as a proportion of a day. So it's 240 divided by 1440, whatever that is. It's like it's a sixth of a day, isn't it? And then that comes to approximately 26. That gives you the average fullness. And then the same again for the assessment wards, the same again for the wards. And what people found, what people say, what people tell us, so this is kind of ground up, theory, was that it was the fullness of the downstream wards which makes the admissions wards full, which in turn makes the A&E full, which in turn makes the A&E length of stay so long, which in turn makes the compliance so bad, right? And there are lots of interactions going on here that aren't sort of stipulated. It's not quite as simple as that. But in general, if we were to summarize, Mohammed and I, what the general gist was of all of these Floopoly workshops of people on the ground, that's the general gist of it. And that's what made me think not so long ago, maybe a couple of years, this idea sprang into my head from a vague memory, because I'm like so old that I can remember when blockbusters came out. There used to be this program on, I think it was on, I don't know what it was on, ITV, BBC, Channel 4, no idea. Anyway, it was ITV, There you go, Wikipedia comes to the rescue. Look at that, it premiered on the 29th of August, 1983. That was probably before most of you were born. So it's quite sad that I can actually remember. Anyway, and the thing about why am I telling you about this? Because they used to have this bit on Blockbusters. It was a program for school-age kids, general knowledge quiz questions. But there was this bit in it where, look at that ridiculous image. He looks like he's too old to be doing it. Anyway, it was called the Gold Run, and they used to have to answer these questions. They'd say, what RR is. I don't know. I can't even think about RR. And then you would, if you got all these questions right, and you got them you got a gold line going from start to finish, then you won, like, I don't know, big prize, which probably in those days was about 25 quid. And it struck me that you could redesign my grid in the spirit of Blockbusters. Okay, so those are my 9 noughts and crosses squares, except I've now translated them into kind of slightly kind of misshapen hexagons. And it struck me that what you can then do is say, well, actually, that's what the Gold Run is that people are telling us about. It's the 411 occupied bed is too full, which means that the AMU and the surgical assessment area are too full, 49.1, which means that A&E is too full, which means that the A&E length of stay is too long, which means that the compliance is too low. And then I also realized when I did that it ended up looking a bit like a turtle. But which is weird. Anyway, the thing is that what Little's Law helps you to do, once you've combined it with the understanding of the chain reaction that takes place in most hospitals between the fullness of the downstream wards and so on, is you start to get an understanding of how Little's Law can be used to try and, provide data, what I call ought to be data to the downstream specialties to say, look, this is what you should be achieving. Right, 5. Where are we doing? 25 past 11. We're 25 past 12. We're good. The fullness hypothesis. So back in the day, it used to be the case. Again, what I mean by back in the days, thinking back to those years, 2016, 2017, 2018, when Professor Mohammed and I were doing these workshops in Yorkshire. So what we found was that the fullness hypothesis was the one that worked. Okay, it was fullness that was the problem. And if what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this data. So this is data from, I'm actually not even going back that far. The fullness hypothesis was still in good shape right up to the pandemic, I think. So that data on the left is will include actually a little bit of the pandemic. So March, right up to the end of March 2020. In fact, I'm willing to bet all of the money in the bank that the leftmost dot on that chart on the left will be the last week of March 2020, because that would have been the most COVID affected of those 52 weeks. Let me tell you what these graphs are. Let's concentrate on the graph on the left. So scatter plots, obviously, each dot is a week. So summarized to quite a high level, but it doesn't matter because there's still quite a strong relationship. On the vertical axis, we're measuring the 4-hour compliance for that week. And then on the bottom axis, on the horizontal axis, and I've colored it blue, what we're measuring is the average percentage bed occupancy in the AMU for that week. And what you can see is there's a pretty strong relationship there at this hospital, Anytown General Hospital, between 4-hour compliance and the occupancy in the AMU. So basically, the higher the occupancy, the lower the 4-hour compliance. So that was the fullness hypothesis, alive and well. I think most hospitals in the land in 2019-20. Fast forward to 2023-24, which is the last period that I've got any data for. Piece of consultancy I did a couple of years ago. And you can see that this is the same hospital. This is quite an important point to make. So there's a few things that you notice. One is that all of the dots there's no overlap between those things. All of the dots have migrated southeast by some considerable distance. And not only that, the occupancy has increased and the 4-hour compliance has decreased over that time. So what we're getting in the 23-24 picture on the right is a much more representative picture, I think, of what's happening in front doors of acute hospitals now. I don't think these have budged very much, and I don't think this hospital is particularly terrible. So what's happening is that the AMUs are fuller, and the 4-hour compliance is worse. But the thing about it is that, can you see that there's not much of a relationship? If we calculate the R value for those dots in that bottom right-hand corner, we're going to get something very close to zero. Where with the R value for the graph on the left would have been something like, I don't know, 0 point, it would be, well, it would be minus, wouldn't it be like minus 0.6 or minus 0.65, something like that. So the relationship has gone. And one of the ways in which I have explored this, and if anyone, I don't know if anyone has been on my visualizing statistics course, so I made the decision about a year ago, maybe 18 months ago, that this was so exciting. This catastrophe that had happened to the NHS was so exciting from a data point of view. That sounds slightly kind of, sacrilegious, doesn't it? But there we go. That I was going to use it as a case study in my visualizing statistics course when we looked at relationships. So one of the things that we do in that course is we say, well, let's have a look at the relationship between the number of beds occupied in the AMU and the mean length of stay in the ED. So what we're doing here is we're looking at 366 days. I think it was 366 days. I think there was a 29th of February in that year. And we're looking at the relationship between fullness on the horizontal axis, fullness in the AMU, and length of stay. And what we all find is that R equals 0.2, and we all sort of explore that. So, well, that's not really anything to get excited about. That's not going to get published in the Lancet, is it? And so we say, well, what if we refine it a little bit and say, well, what if the length of stay in ED, if we restrict it to the length of stay in ED of just those patients who end up being admitted, right? So the fullness of the AMU is probably going to be more likely to affect directly the patients who are going to be admitted, not so much maybe the patients who aren't admitted, right? Well, kind of, but not very much, right? So if we restrict the data to just those patients who end up being admitted, and this is regardless of whether they go to a trauma ward or a surgical ward or CCU or whatever it is, we do improve the R value slightly, okay, but not by very much. And even if we restrict it to just those patients who get admitted to the AMU, so it's really apples and apples now, it still doesn't change it. It's still 0.24. And that's what the pattern looks like. I mean, the red line is deceptive. The red line makes it look as if the red line is basically, it's almost like an oxymoron. I shouldn't have done a red line. It's not deserving of a red line, because it's more important to look at the green dots, which are basically just splattered all over the place. There's not a relationship there. What we're seeing is an AMU that's like nearly always, too full. But remember, I told you that this is an AMU that's got 68 beds. So if you draw a vertical line on this at 68, in fact, should we do that? We can make this live, can't we? If I go into insert, and if I draw a line on there and try and draw a line at 68, which is going to be about there. Is it about there? It'll be a little bit. There we go. It's about 68, isn't it? This data is surprisingly accurate, actually. Some might say suspiciously accurate. But in fact, no, that's pretty good, actually. So that's what I'm doing with each of those dots, by the way, is measuring the average occupancy based on an average of 24 snapshots. So do it properly. So what's happening is that nearly all of those dots are between 60 and 68. So what that's saying is that that's an AMU that's almost constantly operating at above 90% occupancy. So in a way, it's saying it doesn't really matter whether it's operating at 90% or 92% or 94% or 96%, it's still just too full, right? And it means that people are staying too long in the ED. This graph is the antidote. In fact, do you know what? I should have given you, there should be a theatrical kind of prelude to this, shouldn't there? So what I did was spoke to people, went out and spoke to people on the ground, had conversations with them about what was happening in fullness. Interestingly, the conversation that did it for me was a conversation not with people who work in acute medicine, but with people who work in downstream wards. So the two people I remember having this conversation with, I was talking to the pair of them, two people who have a huge amount of time for respect. Emma Rainish is a consultant geriatrician, and Chris Connolly is a general manager for medical specialists who used to work as a charge nurse and a clinical nurse manager, so his background's in nursing. And we were talking about patient flow one day, and we were talking about, when you're making in the day decisions about who to try and target, who you might be able to discharge a bit earlier today. They told me that they have this theory, which they call we make a distinction between active beds and inactive beds. So they would look at the hospital and they would say, if there's a bed, so they would take a snapshot now. So it's like 12:33 on the 9th of December, and they would say, right, who is occupied? So supposing there's 600 beds, they say if any of those beds are being occupied by someone who's already been in for 20 days, forget it, right? We're not going to discharge them today. So we'll call those inactive beds. That might be, I don't know, it could be a third of the beds, I don't know, right? But it's only the rest of them that they're going to concentrate on. So they had this theory that was based on, their own kind of experience, their own senses, that the shorter the length of stay so far of patients, the more likely you were to get a discharge. And I thought, well, maybe there's something in that. And I started messing around, doing some checking to see whether that hypothesis worked. But in so doing, I then said, I wonder if that's true of AMU. And I wonder if we can find a way of like measuring this. And I thought, well, what you could do is you could take the fullness on each snapshot and multiply it by the average length of stay so far of people captured by that snapshot. I mean, and I call it heaviness just to be, bloody minded, really, because everybody else will call it occupied bed days. But when you do that, and you take that multiplied statistic, and you put that on the horizontal axis instead of the vertical axis, what you get for the same service is this blue graph, but a much, much stronger relationship. You've actually got a relationship that's worth talking about. 0.7 is a good relationship. What we're saying is that 4-hour compliance or length of stay in the ED on the vertical axis is quite strongly correlated with the heaviness in the AMU. So that was an important finding for me because it was. Think back to what I was saying about 20 minutes ago, my obsession with Little's law. It was great for me because it wasn't just that I'd sort of found, a new metric by multiplying one number by another, but it was the fact that both of those numbers are vital in my worldview for understanding patient flow. So you're taking your fullness and you're multiplying it by a length of stay. What I also found out subsequently is you can take your fullness and you can multiply it by the number of admissions as well, and that gets you a closer correlation. So I was in just, that was like Christmas and birthday all at once for me because it was like, goodness me, all three of those Little's law metrics, how many, how long, how full, they all kind of multiply together and they're all incredibly relevant. We can get people to look at these. So heaviness starts to make sense to me. And I started messing about. So that is heaviness. What's that? Heaviness past. And then I thought, oh, let's have a look. No, hang on a minute. That's heaviness, heaviness present, I think. Oh God, I've lost track. Heaviness present, I think it is. And then I looked at heaviness past. You can only do this when you've got oh God, I can't remember. Jonas, I can't remember which is which now. This is terrible, isn't it? Given the title of the talk. There's not much between them, but I thought it was interesting that you could say, well, what is it for AMU heaviness past and what is it for AMU heaviness present? And that for me is the explanation for what's going on here, is right. We need to be looking at heaviness, not bed occupancy. So I don't know, I've got the duplicate. That's the same slide again. We don't need to look at that again. So long live the heaviness hypothesis. Started to explore it in a bit more detail. So going to show you some barcode graphs for how I tried to explore it because I got excited about the fact that this idea of heaviness might not just apply to AMU, might apply to downstream wards as well. So let's have a look at barcode graphs to see how I made sense of this. So this is this same hospital. And now what I'm doing with this barcode is I'm just looking at A&E for the moment anyway. And I'm saying each vertical line in my barcode is a day. So there's 366 vertical lines. The horizontal axis is measuring the mean length of stay in A&E for each of those days. So you can see that the worst day over on the right was a day when the average length of stay in A&E was 540 minutes. That's a long time, isn't it? That's 9 hours, isn't it? Is that right? 960, yeah, 960 54. That's 9 hours. Average length of stay. And the best day was a day when it was about what looks like it was about 200 or something like that. So not somewhere between 3.5 hours. So quite a lot of variation. I'm being facetious. There's a huge amount of variation there. And the thick black line is the average. So on average, take an average of all of those days, and it was coming out at about 340 minutes. So, obviously miles off the target. And then what I thought was, no, let's first of all look at these barcodes, but let's look at it through the lens of AMU fullness, right? So what I've done here is I've taken that black line, I've split it into two. So there's a blue line at the two parallel barcodes, blue barcode at the top, red barcode underneath. And what I've done is so there's 183 days in the blue barcode and there's 183 days in the red barcode. How have I decided which to put in the top and which to put in the bottom? It's to do with, I did a league table of the fullness of AMU. So imagine that, I've got a league table of AMU occupancy starting with 100% at the top and going down to whatever the lowest was, I don't know, 79% or something. And then I basically said, right, let's take the top 183 days and let's plot them over there and then see what the A&E length of stay was on those days. And then let's compare it with the least full AMU days. And what you get is a difference, right? So in a way, you'd look at that and say, well, Neil, what do you mean the fullness hypothesis is dead? Because what you're saying is that on the least full days, which are the blue days, the length of stay in A&E was shorter than it was in the red days. To which I respond, yes, but not by much, right? So this is what I mean by that relationship falling down. If I'd done those barcodes in 2019-20, there would have been a lot of divergence between that thick blue line and that thick red line. The fullness on its own is not explaining it. But if you look at the heaviness, then we get that difference. Okay, so what I've done there is I've now taken those 366 days and I've ranked them not according to the fullness of the AMU, but according to the heaviness of the AMU. So the least heavy days, the lightest days, in fact, are the blue barcode days, and the heavy days, the heavy 183 days are the red. And we can see that difference is much more marked. So it's between 300 minutes and 360 odd minutes. It's more than an hour's difference it makes in terms of how long people spend in A&E. And then this was the bit where I was really hoping for something exciting to happen. So which it kind of does. I said, is A&E performance affected by not just the AMU, but the specialty awards beyond the AMU? So what we're looking at here are the kind of the fullness of the bed base. So I think in this hospital, it's quite a big hospital. I think a bed base of maybe about 700 or 800 beds beyond AMU. All the specialties, the whole lot of them all added together. General surgery, vascular surgery, orthopedics, medicine of the elderly, you name it. I excluded critical care. I excluded, day case beds. It was like the proper specialty inpatient beds. But elective, non-elective, everything was in there. And what you see is that fullness affects it. So you can see that when those beds are fuller, length of stay in the ED is about 320 minutes. And when they're least full, and when it's fuller, they're about 340 minutes. So that's a big difference. But when we look at heaviness, that width gets bigger, that difference gets bigger. And when we looked at future heaviness, which I think is the next one, so I've called it future lighter and future heavier. So what we've done there is we're saying, looking at the length of stay yet to come in the specialties, and we can see quite a big difference. So you can see that on the days when the specialty beds are least full of patients who haven't got long to, this is quite a complicated sentence, but I think you get the drift of it. Then the average length of stay in the ED was about 300 minutes, whereas on the days which were the opposite of that, the days when the specialties are full of patients who've still got a long time to go in their length of stay, then the ED length of stay is up to about sort of 380 minutes. So that's quite a big difference, like 80 or 90 minutes of a difference. So why heaviness might help. So this is like me getting to the end of it, thank goodness, because it's just coming up to 1:45. So again, this is another version of my grid that I try and get clinical directors to kind of own sort of forlornly, because most people still look at me as if I'm just like talking complete nonsense. So you can see there's an example here. I think this is a slightly different version of the general medicine from, I think it's possibly a slightly different year that I've taken. 6.4 admissions a day, 9.4 length of stay, 60.2 occupied bed. This is this specialty that's supposed to be living within 55 beds. And what one of the things that I do is say, well, if you're calculating ought to be numbers using Little's law, you can say, well, if we want your maximum to be 55, we think that the average should be 49.3. And if that's the case, then that means your length of stay is going to go down to 8.8. Or you can mix and match. You can bring your admissions down, bring your length of stay down, whatever. It's like a slider. But the reason why this slide is called "Why Heaviness Might Help" is that this idea of multiplying length of stay by fullness to get a meaningful measure is getting people used to the idea of the usefulness of those measures. And then that was just me sort of trying to summarize. Oh no, this is me alluding to that point I made earlier. Do you remember when I said that as well as taking, so let's go through these graphs one by one. On the left, we've got that weak correlation between AMU fullness and length of stay in A&E. Okay, R equals 0.25, nothing very special to write home about. When we compare length of stay in A&E, that's the thing I'm measuring on the vertical axis, with AMU heaviness, we get a much stronger relationship. So again, this is a different year, different, but you get strong 0.62. And then when you multiply the on the third chart, on the orange one, if you multiply the fullness by the did I multiply or did I divide it by? I think I divided it by the throughput for that particular day. You get a strong relationship. So it's a great way, from my point of view, when you're trying to sell this idea of using Little's law metrics, that they're all relevant to how this works. So there you go, questions, comments, and criticisms. I've done that in about 40 minutes, which is something of a record for me. Shall I stop sharing my screen and then Jane can negotiate responses?
Thank you. Right, let me just see. Just go into the chat there. Right, lots to take in there. Oh, straight away we have Paula has got her hand up. Paula, would you like to ask your question?
Hi,
Hello.
Neil. As usual, you have blown my brain completely. I can't keep up with you, is the honest answer. But that's not a compliment because I can't keep up with most people. And you know the future heaviness. Did I miss how you know people are going to stay for how long?
You can only do it with hindsight. So there's a deep flaw with that as an indicator to use operationally because you don't know what it is, right? But
But I like machine learning, but Neil learning.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, there are probably clever people who could probably estimate it with quite a significant degree of accuracy. But whether it would be worth it, I don't know. But I was testing it with hindsight, saying, given that all of those patients have now been discharged and we know how long they eventually ended up staying, wouldn't it be interesting to see what the relationship is? And it was quite galling, really, to find that for the downstream wards, that was the one where there was the strongest relationship. The indicator that we don't know at the time, that's the strong one. So yeah, a bit frustrating, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Simon.
Hi, Neil. Really, really good stuff. Loved it. I was just wondering, did you have a look at sort of making it more granular, looking at sort of specific presentations or I don't know, severity of patients or anything like that? Does that make a big difference? Because I'm just assuming you're just taking all attendances as a just homogeneous lump rather than splitting it down any more detailed.
Yeah, it's just the latter. It's almost as if it's this is going to sound really bad because it's like an article of faith for me, but that I don't. I don't mean this, right? But you'll kind of get the drift. I don't look at case mix and don't look at illness severity, because I'm so desperate to try and make the point about fullness and heaviness that those things are a distraction. I mean.
Yeah.
In real life, if you're sitting down with a clinical team and they really want to roll their sleeves up and do something about it and say, is there a group of patients here? Then you've got to get into that. I had this wonderful conversation with Alan Cameron a couple of weeks ago at Glasgow Royal Infirmary. We were talking about this, and I was saying, you need to get people to look at these histograms. He said, well, you can't. There's no point in people looking at a length of stay histogram and saying, what can we do to change it? Because we need to know about those patients.
Yeah.
We need to know exactly what you just described. We need to know the granular detail. Is it to do with age? Is it to do with social background? Is it to do
I
with
think
the
it is.
illness that they've got and so on? So when you get into that granular level, yes, you've got to do that. And interestingly, actually, just as an aside, because I was thinking like, it's going to be interesting going into those meetings because that's potentially a lot of work for an information analyst
Mhm.
to do all that digging. And Alan said, "Oh, you wouldn't get an information analyst if you just get a medical student to do it. It makes a great project for medical students." So they kind of suddenly realised that actually this could be quite, you could do this. It could be cost neutral.
Yeah. No, I'm a great fan of Little's Law, especially for those sort of big high level models. It's really, really, fantastic for those kind of stuff things. But yeah,
Yeah.
and I guess when they do start asking those more detailed questions, that's when you probably looking at more detailed types of models to answer those more detailed questions. But yeah, no, it's great. And the other thing I was going to ask is obviously you use average. I'm assuming you're just using mean in that sense. Does it make much difference if you use like median? Because we know there are just odd outliers that are always going to skew a mean to some extent, or did it not really make
Yeah,
that
so
much
I'm just
difference?
using means and it's I use means because the arithmetic works with means and it doesn't work with medians. But the again, when you're presenting, I think to clinicians, you've kind of always got to have the median up your backs because they always ask.
Yeah.
And then it's always a nice bonus for those distributions where the median and the mean are coincident. But they
Yeah.
rarely are, of course, with length of stay. But what you just to show that awareness, because yeah, if
Yeah.
you're using the data to describe, then you need to have the median handy. But if you're using the data to calculate, then it's really the mean that's
Yeah.
your friend here. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, just looking at the chat. So there's a couple of things from Matt Oakes. First of all, a comment that the invention of new metrics has inspired finding things to correlate strongly with outcome. We need to change is key to getting people to think about things that can be done to affect them. And then he has a question, but he has no voice. So he's written it in the chat. How would you go about introducing these ideas to busy ops people?
Well, I did a piece of consultancy work about 18 months ago, at my local hospital. So I live in Edinburgh, and my local hospital is the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. And I was doing some work for them, and I managed to persuade the hospital management team to kind of have a go at, trying to come up with Little's Law metrics for all of the um, specialties at the Royal Infirmary. And we came up with a method that we thought sort of calculated gave them sort of little targets for each of these specialties that were calculated in a way that was fair. So all of the specialties were treated using the same methodology. And one of the things that I remember before all these meetings started, so we must have had it's a big hospital. I think there are about 20 specialties. And all these meetings went in my diary, and we went as a double act. I went with Aris Tarathalakis, who was the hospital manager. And I remember before the first one saying to Aris, this could be horrible. We could just be mauled because we're basically going into meeting a clinical directorate and saying, look, you need to reduce your length of stay by 2.5 days and get on with it. But except that Aris is very diplomatic, so that's not how we presented it. And in fact, so the way that we introduced it, Matt, was I went through, I quoted Little's Law, told them and gave them an example from their own data, saying this is how it all works, guys, right? And they all nod, and because it's once you see it in relation to your own data, you can see it sort of works intuitively. And then what we did is we said, and here's the method that we've used to say, here's what your fullness ought to be. And then if we put that back into the equation, we get there. And in general, because these meetings had doctors in them who were, pretty numerate, there was usually the clinical director, a couple of consultants. The rest of them got carried along by that. I think it would have been a different thing if we'd just been talking to, say, service managers. I think that might have been a different thing. But sometimes if the doctors can sort of take the lead, it kind of helps. And the thing that I dreaded did not come to pass. What happened within about 15 minutes of the meeting? So I would do a 10-minute presentation. And then most times the clinical directorate were spontaneously offering up ideas and suggestions for how they could either reduce admissions or reduce length of stay. And we're keen to, and so I think that, I think it can be done. I keep my hope from that succession of meetings that I went to back in whenever it was, April, May, June, July last year. So I think it can be done.
Great, thank you. Right, Laura has made a comment, a straight question.
Yeah. Oh,
back
that's a
to the
good point,
heaviness.
actually. Yeah.
Have you read it?
I've read it. Yeah. So there you go,
Go on
Paula.
then.
There's a way of squaring the circle. And I think, you know, so back in the day, discharge dates were hopelessly out, but I know that in a lot of hospitals, there's a lot of work gone into getting accurate EDDs. And if they are accurate and people audit them for accuracy, then that's something for calculating heaviness future. Yeah. So we've got that. Good point. Yeah.
Right. Any other questions from anyone? Sort of following on a bit from Simon, I was also curious about whether you'd looked at any particular specialties, you know, particular wards going through, because obviously a lot of the, you know, whether it's medical wards or orthopedic wards or surgical wards but
What do you mean
you know,
in terms of what
if
you
you're
mean patient
looking
by
at
patient?
that flow through, trying to see where your inpatient fullness areas are. Did you ever do
Yeah,
anything by
well, I'll
specialty?
say, right, I don't know. One of the problems with this method, it's surmountable, but it's again, um, sort of the doctors on X came to the rescue here. Is that so? Most of the hospitals I've worked with are, and I think this is still probably the dominant model, are hospitals where specialties have bed allocations. So each specialty will be, you know, it might be notional, it might be a bit theoretical, but they have a bed allocation and a clinical directorate that is responsible for that. There is also a model that says it's essentially ward based. So what happens is, so in that scenario, you might have a ward that is notionally the respiratory medicine ward, but it's not big enough. So respiratory medicine patients fill that ward, and they also end up in, you know, 5 or 6 other wards. But there's no attempt made to try and repatriate them. They say, look, because moving patients has got such bad outcomes, they stay where they are. We accept that it's suboptimal, but it'd be worse to move them. And when you've got a model like that, you need to do your calculations a bit differently. So I haven't had a chance to try that on that slightly more complicated model, because it means that finding out what so if patients do move in that model, and what I found from conversations with doctors on X was that they will always try to get the kind of hyper specialist patients into the home ward. They might be less concerned with the less hyper specialist patients. So when you've got ward movements like that, then it starts to get a bit tricky, because you've got to be able to decide when is a ward movement a genuine ward movement and when is it not a genuine ward movement. And so there's some hurdles to get over with that model. But with a hospital that runs a model that's essentially based on specialty bed allocations, then it's relatively easy to glue together the ward stays within that specialty. So that's not too demanding.
Great, thank you. Anybody else got any more questions? Otherwise, you can have a couple of minutes back to go and get yourself a cup of tea before your next meeting, because I'm sure some of you will have something on at 1 o'clock. If not just lunch, you know, just have lunch. Neil, will you be sharing the slides at all?
Yes, I will share the slides. Oh, there's one thing. We've got 2 minutes. There's one thing. One of the couple of people in the questions on the spreadsheet that I got sent, you know, people had a chance to say things that you won't cover, mentioned delayed discharges, as in you know, surely it's all to do with that. Let me just share my screen. I've got an image here. Where are we? I have some sympathy with that view. If I go to, I think it's the next slide. Here we go. So again, it's from a post to put an X back in May. So I did some work looking at, this is NHS Scotland wide. Let me tell you what this scatter plot is. So we're looking at 12-hour waits in ED on the vertical axis, and we're looking at the number of beds occupied by patients in delay. So patients effectively blocked beds, which we can't say, but that's effectively what they are in NHS acute hospitals in Scotland. And each dot is a month. So I got data from Public Health Scotland for each month, and I excluded what I thought were the COVID months, because they mess things up. But what you can see is that it's like a lightning conductor relationship between the number of delayed discharges in hospitals and the number of 12-hour stays. So most of those dots that are on that, sort of parallel, very close to the horizontal axis, are the days before summer of 2021, when things started to get out of hand, and all of the dots since then are the health system going crazy like a train crash. And I feel guilty when I put charts like this up, because it's almost as if hospital managers can just rest easy and say, well, it's nothing to do with us. It's all to do with social care delays. It's all to do with social care delays out of our hands. I don't like that argument, because there's also a lot of stuff there's a lot of delays happen in the internal doors in a hospital, and you can't just absolve yourself from those as well. You know, you could do something about stuff. I take my inspiration from, again, it was a hospital manager at the Royal Infirmary before AphA. She was called Lynn MacDonald, and she was really big on this. You've got to do something about what you're working with. So notwithstanding delays, you can still do it. But yes, again, one of the exhibits when we did those meetings was, yes, you have to recognise the effect of delayed discharges and everything. Yeah, thought I'd just get that in.
Just looking, these are all going on X. So your X handle, I don't know if you want to stick it in the chat. People want to.
Yeah, that's Kurt Stat for me. People do.
Kurt
Not many,
Stat,
I mean,
that's right.
the doctors are on.
Yeah.
Yeah, have I spelled that right? I don't know. Anyway, right, Kurt Stat. So that's me, and I'll share the slides. Yes, so that if you want, I don't know how you share them, but I'll send them to you, Jane. And then
Send them to